Coming up, the gloves are off as the unions and the government of Belize prepare for an $80 million budget battle.
You're listening to Brent's 2 Cents, the semi-serious thoughts of a guy in Belize. And now here's the host of this podcast from somewhere in Belize City, Brent Toombs.
Hey, welcome to the podcast for the week of March the 15th. Well, when the PUP won the general election on November the 11th, 2020, I heard a few people comment that it was like getting back together with an ex-lover. An ex that you had good reason to dump back in the day, and after all these years, likely hasn't changed much. But the sweet-talking ex was an attractive alternative to the abusive relationship of the past 13 years. So, what the hell? It couldn't get any worse, right? Well, here we are, only 4 months into this attempted reconciliation between the PUP and the people of Belize, and the honeymoon phase is most definitely over, especially as far as the unions are concerned. The unions in Belize play a unique role in the election cycle. After either party is in power for a few years, the relationship between the unions and GOB inevitably begins to sour. The key for any government that wishes to remain in power is to keep union discontent from boiling over into outright protest. In 2005, a series of union protests resulted in massive demonstrations and acts of civil disobedience that included a 2-day general strike, a 12-day teachers' strike, a violent clash between protesters and police on the steps of the National Assembly, disruption of water services for much of the country, workers at BTL cutting off all telephone and internet communications, and a riot in Belize City. The National Trade Union Congress of Belize even called for the resignation of Prime Minister Saeed Musa. Now, Musa managed to hang on, just barely, but the fate of the PUP government was sealed, and in less than 3 years, they were swept out of power, losing 25-6 to the UDP. Now, when 2005 began, the major issue for the unions was the budget and the massive tax increases that were being proposed. The Musa government was trying to raise an additional $90 million in tax revenue. And while the unions certainly did not like the idea of increased taxation, their big beef was how GOB had gotten into such a financial mess in the first place. What the unions were protesting was the amount of money that had been squandered by GOB in various ill-fated schemes and programs that only ever seemed to benefit the same small set of politically connected cronies, while sticking us taxpayers with an ever-expanding national debt. The unions were pissed off that government had put Belize on the brink of financial collapse and appeared determined to try and tax their way off of life support, without actually doing anything to fix the root causes of how they ran us broke in the first place. But eventually, what we got was the Finance and Audit Reform Act of 2005, which was supposed to limit government ability to borrow and required Parliament to approve any loan or other instrument in excess of $10 million. Most of the proposed 2005 tax increases did come into effect, and the Public Service Union, who had been promised scheduled salary increases in April, saw their increments frozen in July of that year. Now, I'm not intentionally skipping over every which way the UDP also mismanaged our money from 2008 through 2020. I mean, let's not forget, it was little more than a year ago that the former Chief Justice of Belize ruled that Dean Barrow illegally spent over $1 billion in violation of the Finance and Reform Act. Both parties have done a terrible job managing our money, and Belize was in deep financial doo-doo long before COVID-19 showed up to wreck an already battered and bruised economy. Now, how a country gets into a debt crisis is really not that different from how you or I might. Basically, it means you spend more money than you earn, and you have to borrow to make up the shortfall. For you or I, that could mean using our credit card to put gas in the car or food on the table when we're between paychecks. And a little bit of borrowing is not bad, as long as you don't put yourself into a position where you're unable to repay without suffering extreme hardships, like no longer being able to afford to feed your family because all your salary is now going to pay off loans. And it's really no different for governments. They put together a budget that outlines all the services they want to deliver, and if the amount they plan to spend is more than what they can collect in taxes, then they borrow the difference. It's what's called a deficit. And in theory, running a deficit is not always a bad thing if the government can grow the economy fast enough that increased tax revenues will cover the cost of borrowing. But far too often, governments of countries like Belize get themselves into trouble because they have borrowed too much money without significantly growing their economies. So then they borrow more and add to their national debt. Eventually, they dig themselves into a financial hole that is so deep that they need to keep borrowing just to keep their economy afloat. That's what's called a debt spiral, and it's never sustainable for long. This year, our national debt is projected to rise to 133% of GDP. That's up from 98% in 2019. Even if GOB can reduce the budget deficit from the current 8.3% to less than 1% and keep it that way, Belize's debt ratio is still projected to be at 128% of GDP 10 years from now. So even with absolutely stellar fiscal management, we are looking at decades before Belize will even be close to being financially stable. But the immediate issue is, what can GOB do now to stave off an economic collapse and possible currency devaluation? So far, the Prime Minister, who is also the Minister of Finance, is not suggesting any new tax increases. And let's hope we don't get an April surprise, because I don't see how the economy could survive any increase to GST. Borrowing is out of the question, unless we are willing to accept an IMF bailout package that will come with some very strict conditions. So far, the Prime Minister, who only a few weeks ago said Belize had limited talent, is now completely confident that we have all the homegrown financial experts we need to design our own economic recovery program. So that only leaves one option: reduce government spending. And the easiest way to do that is to simply cut the salaries of people on the government payroll, which is exactly what Prime Minister Briceño seems intent on doing. At least a 10% cut for all public service workers and teachers, netting an estimated savings of $80 million for GOB. Now, obviously, no union is going to sit back quietly while their members lose 10% of their pay. And already the Public Service Union and the Belize National Teachers Union have begun to push back, with the BNTU saying flat out that they will not accept a salary reduction. The Prime Minister says it's either salaries will have to be reduced or people will get retrenched. But one way or the other, GOB is going to have to shave that $80 million from the budget. And this is why I brought up 2005 earlier. Belize would not be in such a critical condition today, regardless of COVID-19, if we had only just gotten our financial house in order like the unions were demanding 16 years ago. PM Briceño can point his finger at the UDP all he wants, and they certainly do deserve their share of the blame. But the last PUP government wrote the playbook on how to fleece the public purse. And then they did diddly squat to fix things in the last 3 years of the tumultuous Musa administration, despite playing lip service to the unions and even some reformists, like Briceño, within their own party. And then for 13 years, the Barrow administration also did little to plug the leaks and loopholes and to stop the corruption that easily costs Belize at least $100 million annually. So here we are in 2021. And what is Prime Minister Briceño going to do to put in place checks and balances to ensure that from this day forward, every dollar of public money will be accounted for and will be spent wisely, before asking the workers and teachers of this country to take an $80 million hit to their pocket? How can you ask people to take an $80 million cut in salary while politically connected cronies collect as much as $10 million from GOB every year in so-called compensation for land scams at the Ministry of Natural Resources? How can you threaten to fire workers in order to save $80 million while a favored few are buying government vehicles, computers, furniture, and even cattle for just pennies on the dollar? How can you put the burden of closing the fiscal deficit on the backs of public employees and teachers when members of cabinet collect more from their various allowances than those hard-working Belizeans earn in salary? How can you ask anyone to sacrifice when the United Nations Convention Against Corruption that was signed by Belize more than 4 years ago has still not been implemented? Look, I get it. The PUP government inherited a complete shit show. But it's their show now. They have a supermajority in Parliament. That means they can not only pass whatever legislation they desire, but they can even amend the Constitution without needing any support from the opposition. So, Prime Minister, you have an amazing opportunity before you to fix a myriad of problems that cost Belizean taxpayers millions and millions and millions of dollars every single year. And that's what you should be doing right now. Make it the law that no Belizean can purchase more than one parcel of government land and put a limit on the size of those parcels. Let Kelvin Lee and all those other not normal persons in Belize pay fair market value to buy from private landowners. And while you're at it, bring in a law that says if government ever sells anyone an island or some sweet beachfront property or a big chunk of a nature reserve for a couple $1,000s, then the purchaser only gets back their purchase price plus maybe a bit of interest after the so-called mistake comes to light. Let's make it illegal for GOB to sell vehicles or any other government asset to anyone without first publicly posting those items for sale with the prices clearly listed. Let's enact a law that lotteries can never again be owned by a private company. Every single shilling that lotteries generate should be used for the benefit of arts, culture, sports, and education, just like it is in most mature democracies. Sure, it might be too late to do anything about the Brad's cash cow for another 9 years, but Belize is going to be climbing out of this mess for decades. And an extra $50 million a year from Lotto and Bolito would pay the salaries of a lot of teachers starting in 2030. And of course, implement and enforce the UN Convention Against Corruption. The PM has the power to do all this and more. But if he won't, the unions have a unique opportunity right now to force him into action. Like it or not, there will be salary reductions and or job losses in the budget that the PM delivers in a few weeks. There is simply not enough money to go around. And John Briceño has the distinction of being the first Prime Minister of Belize who won't be able to borrow his way out of a budget deficit. but the unions can make government at least meet them part way, which would mean getting some real reforms put in place that would help mitigate the need for such massive budget cuts down the road. Now, is it fair to put the onus on the unions to clean up fiscal mismanagement in government? No, absolutely not. But Belizeans have had 40 years to elect a government that wouldn't spend money like a drunken sailor on shore leave, and we've failed to do that miserably. So our last best hope might be for the unions to make us strong.
We want to hear from you. You can find Brent's 2 Cents on Twitter and Facebook at 2 Cents Belize, or email us at podcast@oshaproductions.com. That's OXAProductions.com.
Okay, as always, before I wrap up, I want to mention all the other great Belizean podcasts that dropped new episodes in the past week. Steve and Jeremy are finally back after a bit of a break with a brand new episode of 2 Teaspoons of Belize. Toucan View has a brand new episode. Aria Lightfoot looks at the state of the Belize economy. And Renisha Gentle has a new episode of The Gentle Perspective available on YouTube. I'll post links in the description to this show. And speaking of YouTube, check out a channel called Kimber Life. It's hosted by former Queen of the Bay, Kimberly Santos. And while it's not exactly a podcast, I still want to give her a shout out because she posts some really good original content on her channel. I especially love the reaction videos she made of herself watching 90 Day Fiancé, which of course has a Belizean storyline this season. I'll put the link to Kimber Life in the description for this show, so please subscribe to her channel and support a young content creator from Cayo. Remember, you can be part of the podcast movement in Belize by sharing Brent's 2 Cents with at least one person who otherwise may not know about it. And don't forget to subscribe to all the great Belizean podcasts on your favorite app so you never miss an episode from any of us. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at 2 Cents Belize. And I would especially love it if you would leave a voice message for this podcast about anything you want to talk about. You'll find a link to do just that in the description for this episode. And that's going to do it for episode 29 of Brent's 2 Cents. I'm not sure if I'll have a new episode for you next week or not, as I'm juggling a bunch of video production right now, but I will let you know via social media one way or the other. So until next time, please continue to wear your masks, wash your hands, stay home as much as possible, get vaccinated if you're eligible, and most importantly, be nice to each other.
Brent's 2 Cents is a presentation of OSHA Productions, Belize's affordable professional video production company.